Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Groundwork Podcast. I am, as ever, your host, Kate Kavanaugh. Somebody recently sent me a picture of themselves harvesting some cucumbers while they listened to the podcast, which you'll know that I often put a bit in here to find out just where you are while you're listening. And as I embark on cleaning my house today, this Sunday, which is one of my spaces to listen to podcasts, I just always get curious about where you are. So, send me a missive. We are about to embark on a 2-week journey into the dark matter of nutrition and the heritability of minerals and this adventure of looking well beyond what we understand to be the back of a nutrition panel and protein, fat, carbs, and recognized vitamins and how they impact our soil, our animals, our farming practices, and our bodies. And we're going to do it through two lenses. This week, we are going to explore the scientific and the technical aspect of this with Dr. Stephan van Vliet, who is at the forefront of exploring what he refers to as the dark matter of nutrition. And if that doesn't have you hooked right there, I don't know what will. This was such an exciting podcast, and I encourage you to tune in next week as we explore a more mystical take on how we inherit nutrition through the generations and through soil, and just a very different lens on a similar topic. One of the big questions that I think a lot of us have is, how do these raising practices that we're employing, whether you call it regenerative or biodynamic, or in the case of Dr. Stephan van Vliet, he terms it agroecological. What do these practices make a difference? How do they impact that product? How do they impact the plants that we're raising, the animals that we're raising, the soil that we're raising it in? And ultimately, how do those practices have an impact within the human body? When we're looking to tie together this piece between body and soil, whether it's an animal body or our own animal bodies, I think that there is no one that is more at the forefront and the nexus of that than our guest today, Dr. Stephan van Vliet. And Stephan's work is illuminating the vast array of phytochemicals that occur in plant and animal tissues in a variety of different raising practices, and beginning to look at how those might have an impact on the human body. And he calls this the study of metabolomics, and it's a very nascent science, and you're going to learn a lot about it in this podcast. And I think that this really gives us more of a basis to go off of as we begin to ask these bigger questions. And I think so many of us have experienced this at an empirical and objective level, that when we raise a carrot in a certain setting, we know how much better it tastes, how different it tastes than a conventional carrot that we might find at the grocery store. For those of you that work with meat, raising practices, as soon as you cut into a carcass, whether it's in the rich jewel tones of the meat that you're cutting or the deep yellows of the fat that you are eating, or just in the firmness, the texture, the certain je ne sais quoi that is there. And so this is giving a language and a scientific inquiry to define some of those things and the effects that they might be having. And I think that Stephan's research is just incredible. I was so honored to get to sit down with him. And so I know that you're going to love this podcast. And if it really lit you up the way that it lit me up, may I just ask if you will share it on social media or head over to Apple Podcasts and leave a rating and a review. Those help people find this podcast and recognize that it has some value to give. And in that same vein, just a little bit of housekeeping. I offer this exchange in order to better connect, where if you leave a review on Apple Podcasts, I'll send you a little snail mail note. If you just shoot me a picture of that review to kate@groundworkcollective.com or shoot me a message on Instagram, then we can connect that way, and I get to give you a little piece of gratitude in return. And I can't tell you how grateful I am that you are here and listening to this podcast. It really means the world to me. This is my passion project, and the deeper I go, the more passionate I get. And so there's a lot more on the front. So in that same vein, I'm going to read a review of the podcast. This is from Abby. It's titled Perfect Podcast. I absolutely love this podcast. Kate has a way of speaking that makes you feel like you are there and listening to friends. The Lacey Jean episode hit home, and I immediately sent it to a friend and my mom. In the Josh Curtis episode, she had me with the quote about love in the beginning. Such a fascinating way to see a new side of a human you spend so much time with. I loved the idea of podcasting with your husband. The first episode I listened to was the Ed Robertson, and I immediately followed the show. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Kate. Abby, I can't thank you enough. You just named some of my favorite episodes, and the episode with Lacey Jean, who just blew my mind, and my husband, which was really close to my heart to get to share that episode with the world. I really appreciate that you found value in just two of my most near and dear episodes. So thank you for leaving the review, and please shoot me a message so I can get you a little letter. And with that, I just want to start us off in this road on the dark matter of nutrition. I did something this week that's a little bit different, and I included a couple of the other podcasts that Dr. Stephan van Vliet has been on. And I'm going to do this every now and again. One of my aims with the podcast is that I'm not repeating other interviews that are out there, and that I'm trying to add something novel and different within this context. But sometimes it may mean that you want a little bit more of a guest. And so I want to include the resources and sort of share the love of other podcasts that I enjoy and get value from. So you guys, you're just dying. I know you want to hear about the dark matter of nutrition, and I want to share that with you. And so here is the man, Dr. Stephan van Vliet. Perfect. Well, I'm just so happy to be here with you, and I've been following your work for, I think, the last year or so, and it's just made such an impact on the way that I view the realm of nutrition, and so it's a pleasure to get to speak with you in person. And I wondered if we might just open up with, I'm so curious how you came into this work where you're looking at nutrition and the health of land and soil and animals and humans, and sort of where all of that intersects. And so wonder if we could just start by talking about how you got here.
Yeah, so it started early, the interest in food systems and nutrition. I grew up in the Netherlands, which is a small country in northwestern Europe. I grew up in what in the US would be called the suburb of Rotterdam, which is our second largest city. It's a port city. But I grew up very near to agricultural land. So even as a kid, we'd get our food from local farms, or even later on, I would get my milk directly from a farmer. So I was always connecting with farmers, and it was always, very interesting to learn about that and about how food is grown, how it is produced. And so that's where my interest started. When I was 18, I went to college, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I got a business degree. I thought that'd always be handy, and I'll just go into business, and we'll see what happens. And I started to develop a big interest also in exercise, lifting weights, and within that, food is very important if you want to maximize your hypertrophy and performance. So I was able to sort of shift my work into that and focus on physiology and muscle biology. Did that on humans for a long time, and still do. But in that work where we're studying various protein sources such as whole eggs, egg whites, milk, beef, and we were seeing these different responses that were not per se predicted only by the amino acid content. It was impacted by the fatty acids and probably the bioactive compounds, which is the other 10,000s of nutrients in
Yeah.
foods that do not appear in your nutrition facts panel, but they can impact nutrition. And we were seeing that there was an effect for these bioactive compounds in the food on metabolism, on how our muscles renewed during my PhD in Illinois, this was. And then I got sort of interested in, well, what is an obvious way to increase those things in the food is by the way we produce our food, whether it be plants, the way we grow them, and versus animals and how they are raised, right? That's an obvious way of increasing that, because the saying "you are what you eat eats," or "you are what you eat" is also "you are what you eat eats," right? The animal consumes makes a big difference in the nutritional profile. So I always had this interest in linking agriculture, human nutrition, and when I was in doing a postdoctoral training in Duke University School of Medicine, I was able to sort of pursue my own interest there. And that's where I really started this line of research and connecting with farmers, ecologists, agronomists, and starting to do the systems research where we're taking it from soils to plants, animals, and then in the lab in human nutrition. So I'm originally trained as a muscle biologist, a muscle physiologist, and we profile compounds in human muscle. If you profile compounds in other mammalian species, such as cows or goats or sheep, you actually see these parallels in metabolic health. And these metabolites, many of these can serve as nutrients for us, but they are impacted by the health of the animal. So yeah, I was fortunate enough to kind of push my research in that, and currently I'm an assistant professor at the Center for Human Nutrition Studies at Utah State University within the College of Agriculture. So there's a big support for this type of research, and so I'm happy in my new position and just continuing the work.
Well, I think it's fantastic. And you mentioned something that I think is so important, which is that there are all of these parallels. I think that I certainly have seen as a farmer between soil health and human health and animal health and how they all sort of interconnect. And that's one of the biggest things that I want to explore here today. And in order to do that, I wondered if we might just define a couple of concepts that I know are going to come up so that people have some definitions at the front of this. And one of the first things that I want to define is metabolomics and what that means.
Yeah, metabolomics is the study of metabolites. So it's a fancy word, but you use a mass spectrometer for it. What the mass spec can do is it can identify many unique compounds within any biological sample, whether it being soil, it being a plant, animal, human, or even in a rock or things like that, right? You use that too. Mass specs are also often used for drug testing of athletes because you can detect unique compounds because they have unique molecular weight. So we use it to characterize metabolites. Now, metabolites are intermediates or end products of metabolism, whether it be metabolism of the plant, whether it be metabolism of the animal, metabolism of the human. Many of these metabolites can serve as nutrients to us. So all nutrients are metabolites, but not all metabolites are nutrients. And we must also be realistic. The animal sourced foods, they contain certain metabolites. They are not produced to nourish us. Some of these have nutritive value to us, right? Fatty acids, amino acids, polyphenols, terpenes, and other phytochemicals. We can obtain nutritive value from that. But first and foremost, it is something that is related to either the metabolism of the animal or obtained through their forage. So when we study this, we typically study a couple of thousand compounds when we really go all out and use like 4 different types of machines and look at lipids and phytochemicals and other nutrients. So we're really looking at sort of the whole food matrix and doing this in a holistic way. So as a consumer, if you pick up a package of food, right, you see 13 nutrients appearing on that. It'd be fat, saturated fat, carbohydrates, and sugar, and protein, and a handful of vitamins and minerals. Well, we track about 135 or 150 components in the USDA National Nutrient Database, and we base our food policy on those, and that's very important. But foods in their natural state contain thousands, if not tens of thousands, of biochemicals or metabolites that could potentially impact our health and that have bioavailability and have an impact on our health and metabolism, and can either be a positive or a negative. So we are using metabolomics to really look at sort of what's often considered the dark matter of nutrition, which is all those other thousands of compounds that do not appear on your nutrition facts panel, but that can impact our health.
That's amazing. And you already answered some of my next question, which is this idea that we've reduced nutrition down into, carbs and fat and protein and a handful of vitamins and minerals, when really there is this, and I love when you use this term, this dark matter of nutrition that exists beyond that. And one of the things that I find so heartening about the idea of the whole food matrix is putting it within that context, that it can't be reduced. And I think that so often as humans, we are prone to wanting to reduce things into these individual parts without really understanding the whole. One thing I wanted to form the basis of this conversation, I wondered if we might talk about the relationship between plants and animals and soil. I actually pulled a quote from Health Promoting Nutrients Are Higher in Grass-Fed Meat and Milk, one of your papers. And it says, the constant arms race between plants and herbivores has resulted in an extraordinary diversity of phytochemicals produced by plants. In turn, many of these phytochemicals are concentrated in the meat and milk of livestock grazing these plants. Their presence may act synergistically to enhance human health. And I wondered if we might take a look from your perspective at the interaction between soil and plants and animals, and how that flow of nutrients works within that system.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And first and foremost, I think we often look at this from soil to plants to animals to humans. But if you look at that system, it's also sort of circularity in that, right?
Yes.
Maybe humans are the ones who are extractive and not so much putting back, but in terms of the symbiosis between soil health and plant health and plant diversity is certainly there, and it's sort of circular, right?
Absolutely, it's cyclical.
And the same with animals, right? If they are properly managed and consume some of the vegetation, but not all, proper resting period, the plant can recover, maybe other biodiverse species have a chance to proliferate, right? In turn improving the soil health, but also the plant obtains its nutrients from the vast array of life below ground, right?
Yes.
The many microbes and other organisms that are within the soil where the nutrients are obtained from. So in sort of a top level or like 10,000 foot view, is what we're seeing the following, is that we are seeing these relationships that farmers often tout, but it's also something we see in our work. Soils that have higher total exchange capacity or have an increased amount of soil organic matter, higher amounts of vitamins or higher amounts of minerals, they typically also produce more phytochemically rich plants, and that has a trickle-down effect to the phytochemical richness of the meat. And one project that we did last year and also this year over both grazing seasons is we visiting farmers and farmers that use rotational grazing or some sort of management, basically non-continuous grazing, I should say. There's multiple ways one can do it, but we collect soil samples from these pastures, and then we find the nearest monoculture cornfield, which is usually only a mile away, and we sample soil from that too. And that serves as a model of what would happen if you have animals graze on pasture in an adaptive or what's often called a regenerative way, versus if we grow feed for animals and put them through a feedlot, right? So we are sampling cornfields, and you clearly see that the soil organic matter, total exchange capacity, the microbial life, and the minerals are higher in these soils that are managed with animals versus growing feed that you would then put through an animal in a feedlot. So that's where we see this initial relationship. Then, of course, if we profile the feed, which could be corn-based rations, which are fed to animals in feedlots, it's usually a combination of hay and corn, versus the plants that we collect from the pasture, then those are more phytochemically rich. And then, as a result, when you study the meat of that, the meat is also more phytochemically rich. And it is certainly interesting to see is that, there's always a sort of a gray area, right? Like in moderate amounts, these phytochemicals can have antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects for the animal, potentially also for us. But in very high amounts, they may have some negative effects, which is also why some people, experiencing I think some of those things too with high plant foods or people with autoimmune disorders, which is something we can maybe go into. But the short end of it is that what we're seeing is this sort of symbiotic relationship between the health of the soils, the plants, and the animal, whereas typically more nutrient-rich soils equal more phytochemically rich plants, which then equals more phytochemically rich meat, which contains various polyphenols and terpenes and carotenoids and flavonols and things like that. And I think, that's been certainly an interesting finding that you can detect a lot of these plant compounds in animal source foods too.
Are you seeing that same relationship with biodiversity, both above ground and below ground, that on more multi-species farms that have more biodiversity of species, both within animals and within perhaps plants just out on pasture, are you seeing that correlate to biodiversity below ground in the amount of microorganisms or mycorrhizal fungi in the soil?
Yeah, that is definitely something we're still studying, but there's definitely been other researchers that's slight. So I work with soil scientists, but that's slightly out of my area of expertise. But what we do know from broader literature and what we're finding in initial findings too is that yes, if there is one simplified narrative, then it's biodiversity is key. If there's nothing else that people take away from these two, this podcast, biodiversity seems key. Biodiversity is good for soil health. It's good for the plant health. And then what we're seeing so far in our work is that animals that are grazing more biodiverse pastures, whether it be on public rangelands or people use cover crops or seed mixtures, that provides more phytochemically rich meat and milk versus grazing a monoculture where maybe there's one or two very dominant species. And then, on the other sort of the lowest phytochemical richness, we see when animals are fed corn-based rations in feedlots, which is directly related to the plants that they eat. You actually see this is nice work that was already shown in the 80s, but we were able to replicate it or find the similar things. Is that when the animal enters the feedlot, you see this very rapid dip in these phytochemicals. After about 60 days, you have only half the amount of phytochemicals left, and after 120 days, you have about a third of the phytochemicals left. So that's what we're seeing in our work too. This was already work that was shown from a scientist at NC State in the 1980s. So that also tells you it's the golden rule in science. If you can think of it, there's a big chance someone else have thought of it way before you did, right? And but we're seeing this in more deeper profiling and trying to get some of those relationships laid out, and that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, I want to dive a little bit deeper into some of those relationships. And I think I was telling you before this, but as a butcher I've butchered thousands of animals over the last decade. I've had a chance to see, I call it looking at carcass composition from the inside out. And I've butchered, animals from what you would call an agroecological perspective and from a more monocrop grass-fed perspective and also grain-fed animals. And there is something that is that I can't exactly define that is different about that meat. And in talking to consumers over the years, we haven't had a lot of data when they come in and they're like, well, why is grass-fed better, right? We specialize in grass-fed meat at my butcher shop. And so I think it's incredible that you are really elucidating why that might be the case, and the differences not just between grass-fed and grain-fed, but between grass-fed in a regenerative or agroecological setting and grass-fed in a more monocrop setting. And so I wondered if you just might kind of dive into talking about some of those differences.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting that you mentioned that you can kind of visually see that in
Oh yeah.
on carcasses. I've heard more people say that, and interesting, a little side story, but during my PhD, we did a study with hemodialysis patients and also patients with metabolic syndrome. And then we also, during my PhD, we've done a lot of work on endurance strength athletes. And we always jokingly said, because we do muscle biopsies, so we get a small piece of muscle from the outer thigh. And we always jokingly said we can also, instead of going through all the trouble of doing all the research, we can probably just take a picture of the muscle and publish that and say, here, see, you could just see that the muscle of the endurance trained athletes was so much healthier than people with metabolic syndrome or chronic kidney disease. You could just visually see that, and obviously we still did all the research and indeed found that there was, and it's interesting that you see some of these parallels between the muscle of humans and other mammals, being cows or goats or bison, right? So you do see this health of the muscle, and there's certainly interesting work, and that suggests also it's probably a combination of the feed and the physical activity of the animal. Animals might walk several kilometers a day in pastured systems, so they typically have a little bit more darker meat, more mitochondria in their meat, which is the life of the animal, right?
Really?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's super interesting if you look at it. Like I said, I'm trained as a human physiologist or muscle biologist. I'm looking at muscle of endurance-trained humans, and I'm looking at pasture-based animals, and they look very similar to each other.
Yeah.
They look like endurance-trained athletes, pasture-based animals. So,
And you see an increase in mitochondria at what, how much of an increase?
Depending on, so we look at a lot of the different mitochondrial metabolites, and they're probably, 1.5, twofold higher, some of these metabolites. So there's more oxidative metabolism in the animals, and so mitochondria are sort of the oldest organism, right? And sort of the basis of life of the cell. And we see higher amounts of these in the pasture-based animal, and that could be related to two things. Probably related to the physical activity, but there's also some data to suggest that higher amounts of polyunsaturated fatty acids also result in higher amounts of these mitochondrial metabolites. So it's probably a combination of what the animals are fed and the fact that they have access to plenty of physical activity.
I think that's interesting implications across the board, and I find that piece about mitochondria to be particularly fascinating. I know, you said that two of the things that are really impacting the muscle composition, I guess we could call it, are feed and physical activity, which is what we talk about in the butcher world is what impacts flavor, that it's work of the muscle, how much it's been working and moving, and you find in grass-fed beef that there is more flavor, and in more well-worked muscles, whether that's, shank meat or gastrocnemius, however you want to call that, or a tenderloin, that those are going to be very different in terms of flavor, and then feed, that these are two of the biggest implications for how things taste. And so I think it's interesting that it also correlates in terms of all of the phytonutrients.
Yeah, these phytochemicals, right? When I look at this from the standpoint of human nutrition, I'm looking at these phytochemicals, I'm thinking, wait a minute, these have all kinds of potential health effects, right? But originally, this was studied in grazing systems by French and Italian scientists in the 90s and in the 2000s. They were looking at phytochemicals from the flavor standpoint. They were looking at, well, how can we graze these different landscapes in alpine pastures or the Pyrenees or Sardinia, right? And how can we capitalize on that and create these unique flavors in our cheeses, which are determined by the phytochemical richness. That's
Sure.
really what. I'm looking at this data and wait a minute, these phytochemicals, yes, but they also have potential anti-inflammatory effects, antioxidant effects, and again, this is something we need to study in humans. But sort of from if we throw these phytochemicals on a cell line, right, like a cancer cell line, for instance, you see that there's maybe a reduction of cancer cells. Not to say that grass-fed beef reduces your risk of cancer. I'm not at all implying that, but no, these phytochemicals, they do have, at least in a sort of a very highly controlled environment, they can have potent health effects. And now the next thing is figuring out, okay, do they have health effects in humans? And as humans, we eat hundreds of other foods, and we do 1,000 of other things that could increase or decrease our risk of cancer. So I don't have the illusion that we can ever say, like, hey, this type of meat is reducing your risk of cancer. It's maybe associated with it, but I would suspect that people that buy raised meat are also smoking less, eating more fruits and vegetables, and doing a whole host of other things beneficial for their health. And that's something important to consider in epidemiological research of red meat.
The
And
healthy user bias.
yeah, I mean, the unfortunate part is that we in Western civilization consume high amounts of red meat through fast food outlets as part of diets rich in ultra-processed foods, and overconsume energy. And as a result, red meat is often associated also with it. And there's definitely been more work coming out that suggests that if you account for all of these things or study red meat as in the part of context of a healthy diet, these associations may disappear. There was a recent study that came out from a new analysis from the Women's Health Initiative in post-menopausal women. This was about 80,000 women in the Women's Health Initiative, and when they accounted for many of these things like high energy, high sodium intake, high BMI, you had these associations of red meat intake with diabetes, obesity, heart disease, various types of stroke. They all, or most of them, became neutral once you calibrated for that data or accounted for that data. And there's many studies like that that have been published over the years. But people that consume red meat through a healthy diet are certainly the minority because, we consume about 60 to 70% of ultra-processed foods. And people that consume high amounts of ultra-processed foods also tend to consume high amounts of meat and processed meat as part of these. And you do see a change in associations when you consume it as part of a healthy diet. And it could be a potential where when you consume pasture-raised animal source foods, that has additional health benefits, or at least that's what we're seeing. One interesting thing to note, and what we talked about earlier with this idea of the whole food matrix or reductionism of nutrients, saturated fat, right? We're always discouraged to eat saturated fat. We can argue whether this is for right or wrong reasons, and different food sources will differentially impact it. I think we're now at this point where we feel comfortable stating that whole dairy can be healthy despite its high saturated fat content, especially consumed as yogurt or cheese. But what we're seeing in saturated fat, right, is when people say saturated fat is bad for you, I always think, well, what type of saturated fatty acids are we talking about, right? Because there is saturated fatty acids with 4 carbon lengths or all the way up to 40, although those ones are fairly rare in foods. But the longer chain saturated fatty acids, like 18 carbon plus fatty acids, those oftentimes get enriched in grass-fed meat. And population-based studies suggest that higher amounts of these in the blood of people are associated with a reduced risk of diabetes and heart disease. So whereas perhaps the more medium or the shorter ones, some of those are associated with increased risk. So the type of saturated fatty acid matters. So saturated fat isn't saturated fat, and the food source of saturated fat can impact metabolic disease risk. And those are important nuances, but nuances that do not always make it through the headlines or in sort of simplified narratives of increase or decreasing your saturated fatty acid content and it in the diet. And it will also be important to note, well, it depends on what sources you eat, and maybe focus on these type of sources of saturated fatty acid, because it will be, it was kind of eye-opening to me with the saturated fatty acids that you could see these very long chain ones becoming enriched in the grass-fed meat and milk, and that these are actually associated with decreased risk. So again, lots of studying to do there, but there could be a differential risk or a reduced risk when you consume meat from certain systems versus other systems.
I think that we are constantly losing nuance in our world, and that nuance is important to hang on to and to look at. And I'm curious, with the shorter and medium chain fatty acids, do you see a higher content of those in things like grain-fed beef?
You typically see higher amounts of palmitic acid and stearic acid in grain-fed beef, and then things like ahenic acid or lignoceric acid, which maybe terms you hear less, but those are 20 carbon or 22 carbon, 24 carbon lengths. You see that those are, it can be anywhere from 5 to 10-fold higher. So, and in retrospect, that makes sense to me. It wasn't on my radar until a few years ago either. But if the animal is on a forage-based diet, consuming plenty of grasses and forages, shrubs, etc., you see this increase in very long chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, right? Like the omega-3 fatty acids start to become enriched. There's no reason to think that that wouldn't happen to the saturated fatty acids either, right? And that's exactly what we're seeing in our data, is that happens to the saturated fatty acids too. Same thing happens to the polyunsaturated. It makes total sense in the end, of course, right? But that's always how these things work. But to me, it was also kind of eye-opening to see that.
So when we talk about phytonutrients and phytochemicals, I think generally people associate them with seeing those in plants, and that you see carotenoids or tocopherols and some of these terpenes in plant matter. And so what does that look like in things like beef?
Yeah, so you can also detect those in beef, particularly when the animal is on plant diverse forage, or you can detect them in really any ruminant animal, I would say. We've detected them in bison too, detected them in milk from grass-fed lamb and things like that, and cows. Now, I certainly don't want to make clear at the outset that direct consumption of plant foods will provide much more phytochemicals, and depending on the individual phytochemical. A carrot is a much better source of beta-carotene than beef is. So an onion is a much better source of quercetin or chlorogenic acid than beef is. But one unique thing to consider is it's a way of further enhancing the phytochemical richness of our diets. And I think this is the unique part, is that animals consume forage that you and I cannot consume, right? Because we don't lack the digestive system. So they have access to unique plants that you and I would otherwise not be able to consume. And this could be things like, you get some unique terpenes from things like sagebrush that a goat might browse, or some cattle might even consume certain shrubs and forages. I was on a farm, Alder Spring Ranch, on this past Thursday, and it's very impressive. The farmer herds his animals in the mountains of Idaho. It's an hour and a half drive through the mountains, and all of a sudden there's a herd. Well, it isn't, because you got to find them, but he has to find them. But anyway, there's people with them on horseback herding these animals. But just looking at the sheer plant diversity that they have access to, and we've tried many of the plants the animals eat, and there was wild onions and wild buckwheat and things like that. Just things that are chock full of phytochemicals. You can just taste it. It's like a small leaf of that onion tastes like I'm biting into an entire red onion. That's kind of what it tasted like, right? So, but you see that these phytochemicals become enriched in the meat, and there are certainly also many unique things that we did not try, because they would there were certain shrubs and forages that are have known toxicity to us, but they have, but potentially also have medicinal effects. The animal consumes them, so that way we are probably able to obtain sort of these medicinal effects, but not have the digestive issues that we'd have with some of those compounds that could be quite toxic to us in certain amounts, or maybe some phytochemicals in that forage might be toxic to us, whereas others might be beneficial to us. And having an animal consume those might be a way of getting very unique compounds in that could benefit our health potentially. And it's certainly interesting if you look at individual compounds, then some of these individual compounds do reach the amounts that are found in plant foods. There was some work done with goats, and the amount of chlorogenic acid and other compounds that are rich in green tea.
Sure.
These were found in a cup of green tea, sort of some of the green teas at least, versus some of the milk were almost in similar amounts, right? And certainly other green teas were much higher, but again, there depends on green teas and green teas and green tea. Probably the way that green tea, or those tea leaves were grown, right, in a biodiverse manner or so, might further increase it. But anyway, we found that there was this sort of convergence or similar amounts even, which is super interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's interesting too. I'm curious, when you're looking at something like a goat or a sheep that is a browser rather than a grazer, and is going to maybe take in a larger diversity even than cattle of plant species, if you're going to see some differences there. And additionally, I'm curious if you're going to see those present in the milk faster, right? That this is a almost more available way of looking at something, that you're going to see that milk turnover and change more consistently. But I know just from, as you were talking about this, watching my goats eat things like thistles and nettles and all kinds of plant matter that I wouldn't dare eat. And so, yeah.
No, that's true. Yeah. That, like nettles, and which can have medicinal effects, right? That's a great example. But if you put it in your mouth, then you're probably going to be quite hurtful. So, yes, you can absolutely measure it in your milk, in your bulk tank the next day. Absolutely. It goes very quickly in milk. What the animals ate the day before has an impact on the milk the next day, or 48 hours afterwards. In muscle, in meat, it goes a little bit slower. We've seen some of that work, that when the animal enters the feedlot, you see this twofold reduction. So it's a matter of what you probably feed the animal the last 60 to 90 days will have a big impact on the phytochemical richness of the meat. Whereas with milk, it's almost instantaneous to do that. And coming back to your earlier point, is that we often think of cows as more grazers, and goats and sheep as animals that are more browsers, right? But actually, if you look at sort of locally adapted cattle, they do consume lots of shrubs and forbs too. For instance, that farmer where I was on Thursday, they're in the mountains there, so there's very little grass there, and they consume about half of their diet comes from shrubs and forbs and things like that they're able to capitalize on. And a lot of these have sort of the British genetics, the Angus or the Hereford. So, but when properly trained, or I should trained in the sense that the animals learn from each other, it's also the in utero experience of the calf, right? What the mama cow eats. These phytochemicals are transferred probably to the calf, and then the calf kind of intuitively knows afterwards, okay, these are some of the plants I need to seek out, and they learn from each other too. So yeah, that's super interesting, that sort of nutritional wisdom with animals. And sometimes we think we're the smart ones, but unlike non-human animals, we need to be told what to eat and spend billions of dollars on that. Whereas an animal kind of intuitively knows what to eat and trust instincts and sort of nutritional wisdom. So, and here we think we're the smart ones, but it's quite amazing to see that the animal intuitively knows what to eat. They can also have learned behavior, and
That's
yeah,
actually
able to
That's
do this.
actually one of my questions for you, but I don't want to lose this in utero experience of the calf and that informing intuition, whatever we want to call it, informing the way that it's going to approach eating forage later in life. Do you think that that might have human applications as well?
Yeah, to an extent it does, because if you see that in pregnancy, when women suffer from gestational diabetes, right, that there's poor glucose control in the infant as well, or it might be born with elevated glucose levels, and it's hard because it sets the person or the baby up probably for a life long of struggle or an increased risk of developing maybe diabetes or obesity later on in life, right? So there's definitely work to suggest that in humans, but I think the strongest data we have is from rodent studies, where absolutely what you feed the mother, even the father to an extent, but the mother, or if the mother develops health issues during pregnancy, that carries over into the offspring, and unfortunately have multi-generational effects even. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, epigenetic shifts and things like that are going to have those multi-generational effects. I want to come back to this idea of animals' wisdom in selecting foods for themselves. And this was actually on my list of questions for you, and looking at your work and looking at Fred Provenza's work at just the incredible precision with which animals can select plants that have the mineral and vitamin and maybe phytochemical needs that their body is experiencing. And as humans, we've really lost this, right? We have to listen to podcasts and read books and try to figure out what to eat. And probably not as a scientist, but I'm curious if you have an opinion on if it's possible to regain some of that innate knowledge.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's not a lot of data to support that. One thing I'm thinking of, and it's one of the few studies that has been done, is a study by Clara Davis back in the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
She took in orphans and was able to follow them for like 7 years or so, and they had about 30 to 40 foods that they could select from. The children were able to seek out the foods that rectified their nutrition deficiencies. If a child had perhaps an iron deficiency, it might seek out a little bit more liver, right, which is very rich in iron. When there may be some scurvy, there would seek out things like orange juice or lemon juice to rectify some of these vitamin C deficiencies. So you can see that children selected certain foods and also had weird combinations, and the main finding is that the health of all these children improved, even though they selected different foods, different days, and different combinations, and what worked for them. So there is maybe that idea, and then I like to read old books because I believe we can learn a lot from history, because history always repeats itself. It's always interesting to see when you read an older book and you're like, yeah, we're still talking about the same things, but in sort of a different context. And when you read older books, that a lot of sailors that would all of a sudden start to crave things like citrus fruits and things like that, because they had scurvy. They didn't know at the time what it was, and so there must, yeah. I mean, we're animals too, right?
Yes.
At our core, so it's unlikely that we're the only species that do not have a sense of what we need to eat, and maybe some women during pregnancy start craving things like organ meats or oysters or other things like that. Sometimes you hear of that, or something that's very iron rich, and so we must have some of that. But yeah, proving that in humans is incredibly hard and difficult.
Yeah, I knew that would be hard to prove in humans, but I was curious, and I had read about that study by Clara Davis in Nourishment in Fred's book, and just thought that was fascinating, and hopefully we can find some of that wisdom. I want to return to this idea of biodiversity because I think that this is really the crux of so many different things. And looking also at the biodiversity of a multi-species farm and how that might change things from your perspective, whether that's in the soil or in the meat. And, you know, I told you before, we incorporate ducks and geese and other things, but I also know that you've looked a little bit at rabbits and their place in things as well. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to multi-species diversity.
Yeah, so that's certainly true. And one of the unfortunate things that we've done both in animal and plant agriculture is we made giant monocultures and kind of lost that species diversity, right? It used to be very common back in the day, or even in the 80s, to graze sheep and cattle together. And it's very interesting if you look at some of that older work, is that, and this was not so much looking at the phytochemical richness or the nutritional composition of the meat, but it was looking at primary productivity. And sheep, they exploit different ecological niches than cattle can. And what some of that early work found is that if you put cattle and sheep separate, so you essentially split the paddock or the pasture in half, sheep on one side, cattle on the other side, they're not as productive as when they're mixed together. So you can actually produce more pounds of meat per acreage when they are together without actually what they were seeing, without overgrazing these things, because they explore different niches. And that's one of the things, though, also why multi-species grazing can have a benefit. Cattle, they select certain species but leave others that they don't consume, right? And as a result, there's some plants may outcompete others, and you sort of reduce biodiversity. Part of overgrazing, an issue with overgrazing is that you're creating a monoculture on your pasture as a result of overgrazing, because you don't stimulate that species diversity. So having multiple animals integrated, whether they follow each other or together, is typically a good thing. We also don't. You see this in natural ecosystems, right? There's rarely one type of herbivore, right? You see pronghorns, you see elk, you see white-tailed deer, you see bison, and they're in sort of the same ecosystem and exploit different ecological niches. So it's again sort of trying to mimic nature as much as we can, obviously, using farming systems. And one other thing I think, and that's sort of always bothers me a little bit, is again we've sort of started to see nature and human living and agriculture as three separate entities that need to be kept separate. But in fact, I think it's best to figure out a way that we can all coexist, because one thing, of course, I'm very favorable of the concept of rewilding, but we still have to manage that, because we have built, it's not like an animal can just freely walk. We've built infrastructure, we've built roads, we've built things like that, right? So that does need to be managed. And we can try to manage that in a way where we can try to graze livestock and at least try to integrate and leave also wildlife habitat for that. Of course, you're going to have some displacement, and unfortunately, most meta-analysis of studies suggest that grazing cattle is bad for biodiversity, but I think that is also reflective of the way that we have been continuously grazing for the last decades or hundreds of years for that, really, in North America, when we displaced the bison and use these lands to raise cattle on it, but not managing the same way, right? Because we just started to put fence around it, get rid of all the predators, whereas the bison were always on the move, finding water, getting away from predators, right? So, of course, if you improperly manage cattle, then you are going to be of detriment to wildlife. And it's kind of akin to the nutrition research, is that, of course, if you're going to consume red meat as part of ultra-processed standard American diets, then red meat is going to be consistently bad for you. Of course, if you're going to raise cattle in a continuous grazing and fairly unmanaged, then yes, cattle are going to be bad for biodiversity, right? So, but there is a nuance in that, is that, and different scientists have different ideas about it. I try to approach it with a degree of realism. Is that it's likely as omnivores that we'll continue to eat animal source foods. So instead of abolishing animal agriculture, let's try to support ways of agroecology that do it properly. And then if that means that we also have to reduce our consumption, and then especially through fast food outlets and ultra processed diets, then so be it. But right, it's realistic to think that we'll continue to consume animal source food. So let's produce these in a way that is with acceptable trade-offs, and doing so in regenerative agroecological ways.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. And I think, as you were talking, I was thinking about the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone and how much that trophic cascade changed the ecosystem and actually increased biodiversity. And so I think that there are methods that we as humans can maybe oversee that do increase biodiversity within these systems as opposed to...
And it's interesting that you mentioned Yellowstone too, and which is a very good thing, but it also shows you how some of these things can have ramifications. The wolves, they typically don't hunt the bison, they do hunt the elk. So the elk population is being overhunted by wolves, right? And the bison are able to proliferate. So then you're again creating... Yeah, so that's interesting. I was talking to someone about that the other day who was doing research there, and that's something that they're seeing. And there's this interesting story from the Netherlands too. And we years ago we annexed some red land that was wetlands, but we were going to build houses there and build a new entirely new sort of city there. It never worked. So then we thought, well, now we have this land, let's rewild. And we put a bunch of different like wild cattle on there, deer, some wild horses, but no predators. And of course, they could move a little bit, but they couldn't move that far because they're creeping up the urbanization, right? But okay, we rewilded that in the Netherlands, and we're like, okay, we're not going to do anything about it. Rewilding, right? And as a result, one bad winter, the animal population had blown up because there were no predators. One bad winter, there wasn't any forages, 80% died. People were throwing were throwing hay over the fence and stuff like that. And there was this big discussion: should the government intervene or should we not? Because we wanted to rewild, so we didn't want to intervene. And so, but that also tells you that we should probably find sort of a middle ground in that, right? Where we should rewild, we should support that conservationism, but we should also probably have some sort of positive influence on it and try to manage that as well as we can, wherever it being allow greater movement of animals and are able to sort of manage that. And maybe this is controversial, but there's also no reason why we could not, to an extent, act as the predator if we've lost other predators. Which could be through hunting or things like that, right? So I know it's controversial when you say rewilding and we let the bison population blow up to 10 million, but then is there a reason why we could not hunt some of that? And those are interesting things, and almost becoming a philosophical discussion at that point. But I think we strayed from where biodiversity is typically a good thing. Yes.
Yes, and if we're in service to biodiversity, then I think that we're going to have to come up with some unique solutions when we don't have large tracts of land, when we don't have apex predators that are managing the movement of things like ruminants across those large tracts of land, and that we're going to have to begin to have more philosophical conversations about what it's going to take in order to raise meat to feed a growing population and to, again, be in service to biodiversity. I have this question. I'm curious if you've looked at how monogastric animals and how phytochemicals upcycle into their tissues. And one of the things that we've been looking at here on the farm is what we feed our animals. And I think we talked about this at the beginning, that you are what you eat eats. And so when we have something like pigs or chickens that are going to require some exogenous inputs in the form of grains, then it matters probably both A, how those grains are grown, whether or not they're grown organically, and what that soil looks like, if cover crops are used, or if it's no-till, some of these things, as well as some of the anti-nutrients that are going to appear in those grains in the forms of phytates or lectins, and how those are going to diminish nutrient uptake of things like zinc and iron in the chicken or the pig that's eating them. I know here on our farm, we soak our grains in some hope that we can sprout them and get some of those anti-nutrients down. And so I was just curious about your take on monogastric animals and feeding
Yeah,
grains.
yeah, no, it's certainly interesting, and they will always require some exogenous input. I'd say some work would suggest, and we're doing some work on poultry now too, is that you're better also off feeding vegetable scraps to the animal if you are able to do that, because a lot of the peels of I don't know, oranges or whatever vegetable scrap matter you do not consume, right? It's quite phytochemically rich, or stalks of things
Yes.
that we cannot digest, but the chicken or the duck can, because of their specific digestive system, right? The gizzard, and they can uh, uh, digest much more rough material that we cannot do to a higher cellulose content. So I'd say vegetable scraps. There's an opportunity for that. Or waste streams. I know we haven't, in the U.S., North America, the main waste stream that we feed is from grain, or we even sometimes grow grain and feed it to the animal, which is perhaps not ideal. But if we can look at circularity into, if you have a waste stream that you have access to, or you're able to get fruit and vegetable scraps from waste streams that would otherwise go into landfills, and I know they've done some work, especially it's more common in Southeast Asia and Japan, where they take a lot of fruit and vegetable waste and treat it and then feed it to pigs, right? And that's probably also what people used to do in the past, right? They had chickens, and you just feed the scraps to them. Probably unknowingly, people were increasing the phytochemical richness of that
Yeah.
in their meat, and so you do see that benefit, but yes, chickens also require a high energy, high protein source. But there's probably something to be said for feeding less grains and reducing
Absolutely.
edible crops that could otherwise be fed to humans, and using waste streams instead. It will require a little bit of a rethinking of our food system, right? Because now we typically just put it into a landfill. But if we somehow are able to do to capture that and feed that to chickens, and some integrated farms do that, but I'd say it's probably not happening on a large scale. But there is some interest, and I haven't studied this with chickens, but I had an idea, and unfortunately got shut down. But who knows? We do it in the future. I had this idea of what if we take in North Carolina there was a big grape industry there. And the grape must, like the byproduct, what if we feed that to dairy cattle? And as a way of increasing the phytochemical richness, I wanted to dub it red wine milk. But to look at I had it all figured out. But no, that is a good way. And it's not that common here, but it is common in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in countries where they're perhaps forced to do that because they do not have this incredible availability of food that we have, and we can be very wasteful here and not starve, right? But in other countries, there is maybe more of a need for circularity, and if we can achieve that too, or food waste, if we can try to at least get that to monogastrics, I think that would be a good way of doing that. And yeah, certainly there are some small scale initiatives that are doing that, but it's not happening on a large scale, and part of it has to do, of course, with the way we have it set up, and it requires additional investments, and it also had to do with the fact that grains, they're not as cheap anymore, but fossil fuels used to be cheap, grains used to be cheap, right? So it sort of favored that system in the past, and after the Green Revolution, where we need to feed a lot of people, a lot of food, prices were cheap on grain, could grow a lot of grain very easily, and we'd feed that to animals. But yes, we're finding out that it's maybe not ideal for things like an omega-6 to 3 ratio, right? Which becomes higher when you feed grains, and so there's less omega-3s, more omega-6s. It probably has less things like beta carotene, and has less of alpha tocopherol, vitamin A and vitamin E precursors. It has less phytochemicals. So as a result, indeed, we have reduced the phytochemical richness of the meats, and we're seeing that also indeed when chickens or eggs, or chickens, whether you look at their eggs or their meat, when they're on forage-based diet, then higher polyphenol content in the eggs and in the meat.
I know we push both our chickens, both our meat chickens and our laying chickens, as well as our ducks and geese, and we rotationally graze our pigs. And I'm fascinated that they will take big wads of plant matter that they'll kind of juice by chewing, and then swallow the juice and just kind of discard some of the thicker, more fibrous plant material, and just the way that pigs manage on a pasture a little bit differently, but they still require, that the pasture isn't going to have a high enough protein content, especially for something like a Berkshire or a Tamworth, though we actually don't have to feed grain to. We have some Cooney pigs, and they get no grain, and they do really well.
Fantastic. Yeah, it'd be very interesting to see what I don't know if you've ever tested the omega-6 to 3 ratio on the pigs, but I bet
we have some out for testing right now, and we haven't processed any of the Coonies because they have such a longer grow out. You're looking at a 2-year grow out versus, something that's going to be ready in between 6 and 12 months on a more conventional hog breed like a Berkshire or a Duroc. And so that's something that I'm really interested to do. But I think it actually brings up one of my next questions, which is around seasonality. Because if you're seeing this twofold decrease in phytochemical concentration in grain-fed beef over a 120-day feedlot stay, then I assume that you're also going to see some decrease over winter in animals that are fed hay or fed, something that isn't just fresh forage.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And if you sort of, picture this scale of January, May, August, and then November or so, then if you draw a line for the feedlot, it'd just be a flat line. In August or in January, the phytochemical richness is nearly the same. If you look at the forage-based systems, then in January it is maybe like 1-fold higher, 1.5-fold higher than the feedlot system. So it's always higher than the feedlot system, typically, if you feed some sort of forage. Because hay is still more phytochemically rich than corn-based rations. But you see this increase during the spring, sort of hit this peak, and depending on where you're at, it might dip a little bit during the summer if it's very hot, and it might climb back up a little bit again during the fall when some of the cool season grass are coming in. But anyway, you see this increase during the spring. It stays quite high during the summer into the fall, and then when the winter starts, you see this decrease again in phytochemical richness and hitting probably sort of your bottom at December or January. So there is seasonality, which is probably why in the past we slaughtered animals as much as possible after the grazing season. And you see that even with Native Americans, their hunting patterns were based on seasonality, where they would maybe take animals in June, maybe not so much over the summer when it was super hot, and then would hunt animals again sort of before the winter sets in the fall, when there would be more forages again. Super interesting that we figured it out to trial and error later, but it's again the wisdom that people typically things we find out in science. There was wisdom already in the past, which sometimes is frustrating because it means that we kind of know a lot of these things already, but because it's someone observing that or writing it down in a book from the 1800s, then it's not reliable or something like that, right? Because wisdom, and now we rely on science and data. But another interesting side story is that there's a book from Warren Angus Ferris. It was written in the 1800s, 1840s, and he traveled across the Great Plains with with a group that were hunting bison. And he describes in that book during the grazing season, he said something, and I'm paraphrasing here, is that the meat was so delicious that it would nourish themselves. They required no plant matter to sustain themselves, and it had the most rich taste he had ever experienced. In the 1840s, he was talking about phytochemical richness of that meat, which we now find out 200 years later, right? Near 200 years later, it's like, oh yeah, he must be talking about the phytochemical richness of the meat. So you see that these things are happening, and again, hitting the peak phytochemical richness in the fall and then during sort of the early summer, and yeah, that's a consideration, of course. But we also many farmers like to if everyone's slaughtered in the fall, right, then the processing facilities will be quite busy, and
Yeah, it's a
and
big
not so much.
bottleneck.
It's a big bottleneck. So there's obviously, we're living modern times. So are there ways around it? We're working on a project where, especially here out west, right, as there's no a lot of grazing during the winter, northwest, with sprouting. So it's a big, sort of what looks like a container, and you sprout forages fresh. So it's still probably better than feeding hay. So you sprout the forages, and it comes out looking like a piece of turf, like you would put it, in your lawn, basically. Mm-hmm. But you give it to the animals, and the animals consume it, and the water is recycled while the grains are being sprouted. And again, we're looking at that. If you only grow wheat, grass, or barley, then you're probably creating a monoculture. So it might be bad to have, 5 different types of seeds in there. That's what we're studying. But if the forage-based actual data is any consideration or any indication, and I suspect that biodiversity in sprouting systems are going to be the same way, and biodiversity is better for the animal. Probably even best if they could somehow self-select a little bit of that too. But anyway, those are ways by which you can maybe circumvent some of that seasonality by feeding some from fresh forages and maybe some agrochemically rich waste. Of course, you cannot feed too much, but even to a ruminant, you could feed probably some wine residue, right? And especially if they become adapted to it, and you take it slow. You cannot put an animal on 80% corn right away either. Then they'll develop issues. Probably it's the same here. But yeah, those are ways that we're thinking about of increasing this, and again, it would require a little bit of a shift, right? But maybe we're one day forced to make that shift. I mean, we're growing a ton of alfalfa here out west.
Yes.
And you can harvest it 3 times, but all day those sprinklers are on all day. Yeah, morning to night, and I'm not sure if in 30 years we can still do that. I mean, where we're at the Salt Lake, it's a third of what it was in the 80s, the size of the Salt Lake, because we're constantly extracting from it. No, not from the Salt Lake, but before it reaches the Salt Lake. And yeah, there may be a time where we have to, we should probably do it now, but there may be a time where we really have to start conserving our water, and something like that may no longer be feasible, and we need to switch to something else that requires much less water, instead of harvesting alfalfa and feeding that to animals over the winter. So yeah, those are all considerations that again tie in the sort of the ecology, right? Because you cannot never see these things in isolation. That tie in sort of the agronomy, ecology with nutrition and animal health. And but yeah, that's one way. That one thing I'm excited about is potentially using some of those techniques, such as sprouting, to provide fresh forages to animals.
I'll be really curious to see how that work goes, and also what the setup and infrastructure looks like, just from a farming perspective, of being able to execute that, without it taking just too much time. Yeah. And I think that you mentioned something that's incredibly important to me. Looking at water in the West, which I've done one other podcast on, and I have another one coming up. And I think that, we're hitting the 100-year mark of the Colorado River Act, and how that water is distributed across the upper and lower basins. And I think that it's important from an ecological standpoint to consider how we're utilizing water, and how what we're eating is utilizing water, whether that's an almond or a steak, and what those considerations actually look like, also in terms of nutrient density.
Yeah, and it's it's a difficult process, of course, because maybe it's not ideal to raise Black Angus in the Arizona desert, right, on irrigated pastures. So, but
Maybe not.
yeah, you also have to consider farmers and their livelihood, and so there are things if we're phasing that out, that we do so in a way that we do not have an incredible demise of rural America that we already see. But on the other hand, it's something that probably needs to happen. I mean, in my home country, the Netherlands, right now, there's large-scale farmer protests, and I have mixed feelings about it because, on one hand, you're dealing with people, with farmers, right, that see their livelihood threatened. But on the other hand, the Dutch government is pushing for more agroecology and more biodynamic systems. So, getting animals out on pasture again, right? Using circular waste streams, integrated crop livestock systems. A lot of what the pushback against is from the Dutch government is about these monoculture systems, right? We have a large poultry and pig CAFO operations that require a lot of external inputs, and that's kind of what we're now thinking, like, well, we don't need to feed ourselves, we export a lot of that. Should that be something that we should be doing, right? And then the push is like, well, let's try to get animals out on pasture again. It means reduce amounts of reduce number of animals, and also stay with cows, get those more out on pasture again, so that we limit the external feeding inputs. And on one hand, that is great, and it's something we're advocating for, but on the other hand, it threatens the livelihood of many farmers. And that's kind of what we're seeing also in the Netherlands now with these large-scale protests, that there needs to be a good plan of either helping farmers to transition into agroecology. And maybe one of the unfortunate things is that we, as one of the first things to reduce emissions, we chose farming instead of maybe things like aviation or other fossil fuel intensive or cars and things like that. So that was maybe we're working on that too, but it was maybe a little bit of an unfortunate pick, but it is in line with sort of the zeitgeist, right, where we have very much concerns about. We're heavily focused on emissions. That's just the way it is. I think it's again it's important, but only looking at that is very simplistic and problematic. And then you get these weird ideas that growing locking chickens up in a CAFO is more sustainable than extensive systems or having animals out on pasture, just because they emit more, have
Methane.
a larger amount of emissions. Yeah. So with the focus on CO2 equivalents, and then they were like, well, we should also probably consider sequestration, biodiversity, water, soil health, and things like that, right? Which are typically not as well managed in an intensive system. But if we look totally at emissions, then I could see why people come to the conclusion that locking a bunch of animals up in a confined system and bringing them to slaughter weight within 30, 40 days, and it might be a better idea. But I think that kind of misses the point of sort of the broader concept of biodiversity and ecology.
Yeah, I think that there's an aspect of that being a very reductionist view and having this sort of greenhouse gas tunnel vision where you're not considering all the other factors that are at play within a holistic system. And I'm glad you talked about that, because that was actually something that was on my mind with your being from the Netherlands and what your thoughts are on those protests, which are very prominent right now. You mentioned something that I don't want to lose, which when you were talking about the book by Warren Angus Ferris, you mentioned him talking about flavor. And I was actually curious if, as humans, if we're not looking at things through a mass spectrometer, can we judge phytochemical richness through flavor? And does that also contribute to satiety, especially when you're looking at nutrient density?
That's a good question. The short end of it, I don't know. Not in the context of beef. We can definitely taste it, or some people can't taste it, because that's what the cheese industry, especially the European cheese industry and the wine industry, is based around, right? Like various eco-regions that provide very unique flavors that people can taste. and part of that is because of the phytochemicals. So it's a concept called terroir, which in French is basically means the territory. So you can taste the territory. What
Taste the land.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not sure if it will lead to greater satiety. It could be. It could be that if you look at the concept of nutrient density, then yeah, you could argue that there's greater nutrient density in meat from forage-based systems because they accumulate more phytochemicals. So those are about 2.5 to 3-fold higher. And those are, 20,000 compounds probably. We cannot measure 20,000 compounds, but there are, which is why we're also still scratching the surface of this. We're just scratching a little bit of a bigger surface than has done in the past. But I certainly don't want to claim that I have this figured out. We don't. But anyway, we're able to look at, maybe 200-300 phytochemicals out of the probably 20,000 or so, maybe more. But yeah, I'm sure people can taste that. But whether it leads to greater satiety, we're not sure. We're doing a randomized controlled trial now where we're feeding people grass-fed beef, grain-fed beef, and then a plant-based meat alternative. And we are asking about satiety and how they feel and what they think of the flavor and things like that. And so we'll see. But it's also sort of it depends what you're dealing with. Untrained people, trained people, and so there's a lot of nuances to that.
There's a lot of objective.
People can taste some of these things, and but yeah, it would be an interesting study, a sensory evaluation study in the past or in the future, to see if people can taste that and if they feel more satiated after eating more phytochemicals. Who knows? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's something I know that I've tasted a lot of grass-fed beef in particular over the last 12 years and can definitely note differences between these things just from having done this for a very long time over a lot of different animals from a lot of different farms and ranches. You mentioned that you're working with a study looking at grass-fed and grain-fed and plant-based meat, and I know that you've also looked at the phytochemical richness of plant-based meat kind of in comparison to grass-fed meat. And I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we've looked at phytochemicals. Well, we've looked at many things. We did an untargeted metabolomics assay, so we looked at a couple hundred compounds, but there were things like amino acids, fatty acids, biopeptides, carnitines, carnosines, taurine, creatine metabolites, glutathione metabolites. So a whole host of things, but some of those were indeed phytochemicals. What we found is that there's different phytochemicals in a soy-based burger versus grass-fed beef. Some beneficial compounds, especially the soy isoflavones, which could have potent health effects in moderate amounts for various people. They did have higher amounts of those, the soy isoflavones, in a soy-based meat alternative. So this could be beneficial. Grass-fed beef had other compounds and other phenolics in it. They were not the same. So it comes back to this idea, if we look at it in the broader picture, is that I am sort of very much in favor. People think because I study meat that I'm sort of on a carnivore diet or so, but it's the opposite. It's far from the truth. I consume a lot of fruits and vegetables myself, and I think it's very important to consume plenty of plants in our diet, especially fruits and vegetables. But it comes back. But we can also obtain nutritive value from animal source foods. Animal source foods provide nutrients that plant source foods do not provide, and vice versa. And probably taken together, we make for an optimal diet. And the amount of animal and plant source foods you can argue about in varying degrees, but most people fall on the spectrum of omnivory, where they do well on including both plant and animal source foods. Plant source foods, higher amounts of thiamine, folate, vitamin E, certain phenolics, right? Or overall, they are more phytochemically rich, plant foods. But then on animal source foods, we can get vitamin B12, bioavailable forms of iron, zinc, DHA, EPA, especially in fish, but you can also find them in pasteurized animal source foods. And they can actually raise the blood levels of them. And then also very unique compounds like taurine, anserine, creatine, carnosine, which are important for cognitive function. They're important for muscle health. They can be important for heart health. While these compounds, just like phytochemicals, are non-essential, it doesn't mean that they're not important for our health, right? So especially for vulnerable populations, elderly, children, in children, especially infants, taurine is conditionally essential, which is why it's added to plant-based breast formula replacement. Yeah, exactly. So these are things, but it's not to say that in older adults we can also not benefit from that, right? And or even over through our adulthood. It's just during infancy, in terms of rapid growth or fairly rapid decline, is when we start noticing some of those effects, right?
Yeah.
Then, we have less cognitive function. Could it be because we didn't consume a lot of taurine, anserine, and creatine throughout life? Probably did another 1,000 other things that could result in a cognitive decline, right? So it's hard to prove these things, but at least from sort of the standpoint of physiology, I worry if we start taking those things out of the diet and just start replacing our animal source foods with plant-based meat alternatives. Not to say that people cannot be on well-designed vegan diets, and for some people it may work very well, but I'm talking here about like global diets, right?
Yes.
Where like majority of the population. It's not to say that many people couldn't benefit from eating more fruits and vegetables, unprocessed plant foods, but that's a whole different discussion than taking animal source foods off the table. I know I'm digressing, but the short end of it is that we did metabolomics on the plant-based meat alternative and grass-fed beef. Sometimes they're marketed as, plant-based meat alternatives are going to replace meat. Mm-hmm. There was a 90% difference in metabolite abundance. About 30% of these metabolites were only found either in the plant-based meat alternative or in beef, or vice versa. Mm-hmm. So already 30% of nutrients are just completely different, and the other nutrients or compounds were in different abundances, which could again impact metabolism and health. So the short end of it is that a plant-based meat alternative is not a one-to-one nutritional replacement to meat, despite having nearly identical nutrition facts panels, because the plant-based meat alternative uses soy protein isolate, so same amount of protein as beef, uses sunflower oil and coconut oil, total fat, saturated fat the same, adds synthetic vitamins and minerals to it, or soy-like hemoglobin, a source of heme iron. So if you look at these 50 nutrients, you think, oh, they're the same, I get the same nutrients. But yeah, if you sort of peel back the onion layer, then yeah, they are as different as the plant and as a plant and an animal food are supposed to be. Like, probably as different as a soybean and a piece of meat are to be, and or carrot and an egg are, right? I would imagine that. So that I think is important to note for clinicians, food policy makers, and consumers, and that was sort of the premise of our study. And of course, people say, well, Stephan, of course they're going to be different, and yes, we didn't know how different they were going to be. They were more different than I expected them to be, but it is important to find out what are these differences, and not to say you cannot eat a plant-based meat alternative and be healthy. If you switch out beef with a plant-based meat alternative a few times a week, in certain cases that may, there was a study, a swap meat trial, that suggests that, it's perfectly compatible with good health and may have some benefits for weight loss and LDL cholesterol. So not to say that these things are unhealthy, but we do have to be careful that we should realize that these are not one-to-one nutritional replacements, and taking that completely out of the diet, without adequate provisions may be problematic.
I assume the same could be said for lab-based meat, which to me feels like it's even further removed from the whole food matrix, and especially from this idea of metabolomics and phytochemicals that are getting into meat via the animal eating, and here in a very sterile environment, just sort of reducing it to its just a handful of constituent components as opposed to the whole food matrix.
Yeah, it will certainly be very interesting. I mean, I think, cultivated meat is going to be part of the market at some point. Plant-based meat alternative is going to be part of the market. Non-dairy milks have already been part of the market for 20, 30 years, right? So, not to say it's not a good thing and that it shouldn't be supported. I do support it, but we also, it will be very interesting to see to test cultivated meat versus field-produced meat, if we that's how we maybe say it.
Okay.
But
I hadn't heard that yet.
that might might be the way of lab grown meat or field grown meat. But it would be interesting to see metabolomics, because one of the things that we see is like what the animal grazes, right, has a 50%, 60% impact on the nutrients that you find in that. How are you going to replicate that in a cultivator or in a bioreactor? I'm not sure. I mean, maybe there's ways to add some plant material and let the cells soak it up. I'm not 100% sure, and perhaps it could be used for the good, where we can add more omega-3 fatty acids to it, and I could certainly see also the benefits of it. But yeah, it will be interesting to see, and keep an open mind. And but I am excited the moment we'll be able to profile it, to see how different are meat from different systems.
Yeah, I bet you are. I bet you are. I want to get back a little bit to meat, and one of the questions I had for you was whether or not you're looking at older animals. I know that looking at like cull cows from the dairy industry, and I know that here on the farm we wait until animals are older to process them. Obviously, we have that benefit because we're an incredibly small operation and we're mostly raising for ourselves. But like we have a 5-year-old steer that we'll process here in the fall. And we keep our goats much longer, and we eat a lot of stew hens. Does it stand to reason that you're going to see some of these metabolomics change as things get older?
Yeah, you do. It's super interesting because some of the most yellow steaks I've ever seen were from an 8-year-old animal, and it's impossible to comprehend almost how yellow they are. It
Yes,
looks
it is.
like butter. Very deep yellow butter. This is because of the carotenoids in there, and we see that in our data too. If we then profile it, and they have fold more carotenoids than some of the grass-fed meat that was slaughtered at 24 months or so, right? Because it's just a further accumulation of these compounds, especially in the fat. The fat turns over very slowly, so it accumulates things very slowly, loses things very slowly, but also accumulates things very slowly. Pros and cons. The con is that if there's heavy metals or other agrochemicals in the soil, then they accumulate typically in the fat portion of the animal.
Yes.
Like PCBs and things like that. Depending on how the land was managed, even 20 years ago, you might still have some of the ramifications. But anyway, a lot of these compounds are fat soluble, but the fat turns over so slowly that if you give it more time, it accumulates more and more of these compounds. And so there's definitely something to be said for slaughtering animals at an older age. And it's so incredible to see some of these things. It's just incredibly yellow, orange, and
Yes. Yeah,
delicious
they're beautiful.
too.
Yeah, they taste good too. It's that question about is flavor a part of this? Within that same vein, what about organ meats? Are you also seeing enhanced or more compounds within organs, which feel like they're concentrated anyway to me?
Yeah, they're more phytochemicals, about 5-fold higher or so on average, 4 or 5-fold higher than muscle meats. So organs, they accumulate more of these phytochemicals, and typically the omega-3 content is very high too. And also the difference between grass and grain fat is much more magnified in the organs.
Oh, interesting.
You might find maybe like 5 to 10 milligrams of DHA in grain-fed meat, but then in the grass-fed meat it might be like 80, 90 to 100 milligrams. And that's where you start to approach the organs of animals. This is liver I'm specifically talking about. Liver sort of approaches whitefish in terms of the omega-3 content. So that's certainly very interesting. Yeah, so it's quite high. And in muscle meat, we typically see an omega-6 to 3 ratio. The lowest maybe like 1.2, 1.1 or so. So that's the ratio of omega-6 divided by omega-3s. Then in the organs, in the liver, you see an omega-6 to 3 ratio of 0.7, 0.6. So there's more omega-3s than omega-6s in the liver of grass-fed animals. So you see a lot of omega-3s accumulating in organs typically, and you also see some in the kidneys, in the heart. I'd love to study some brain because that's where probably it's most richest. But of course, we don't consume a brain anymore these days, or rare in many cultures to consume the brain of the animal. But that's probably a very rich source, or that is a rich source of DHA as well. And it'd be interesting with some of the modern techniques to study the brain of cattle, if we ever have the opportunity to look at phytochemicals. There have been people that studied in the rat brain, and you find a lot of phytochemicals in the rat brain. So there's no reason to suggest, and probably in our brains too. I imagine
makes sense.
Find people that are well. Here's what I can say: rats that are on more phytochemically rich diets have more phytochemicals in their brains. Mm-hmm. It could be that humans eating more phytochemically rich diets have more phytochemicals in their brain. It could be that cows eating more phytochemically rich diets have more phytochemicals in their brains. So, which could beneficially impact health.
I know that with bovine spongiform encephalopathy, it's pretty hard to get your hands on cow brains, but I know that at the butcher shop, we get lamb brains all the time. Just depending on how they come and how they're processed, and we sell and use them. And so,
oh really? I might have to buy some off of you then.
It's out there, and
yeah.
Yeah, especially also within processing houses that use stun guns as opposed to retracted bolt guns, so that it's not actually putting any skull matter into the brain, which makes it a consumer hazard. So yeah. It's being done, and there are brains out there. I'd be really curious to see what you came back with. I know that we utilize brains here on the farm, depending on how we process, because that's something that's important for us from a dietary standpoint.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And to use every last bit.
Yeah, that's the most respectful thing to do. Or other people would obviously argue that the most respectful thing to do would be not to consume the animal to begin with, but at least once if you consume an animal, then yes, maximizing everything of it is in that regard, I think, the most ethical thing to do. And so important to really try to utilize everything of the animal. And the cheaper cuts, the sort of the bony cuts, right? Like they're delicious in a stew or when slow cooked. And they're some of the most, or even like beef cheeks, if when well prepared. Slow cooked, they're very good eating. So even though it has sort of that yuck factor to it with people, which is something we need to consider. And if we have a yuck factor for beef cheeks, then I don't know if we have a yuck factor for some of the alternative proteins too. That's probably even more so, right? So that's an important consideration also, I think.
I think so too, and as a whole animal butcher, I'm a big proponent of that. I'd also be curious how things differed in cuts. I mean, beef cheeks are going to be such a collagenous cut because there's so much connective tissue in that region, and I know that my husband and I are big proponents on having a good methionine to glycine balance in our diet and making sure that we're consuming some of those cuts that we might not have a taste for in the same way, or finding ways in which we have a taste for them.
Yeah, I sort of, the way I oftentimes eat is that I would buy maybe like half an animal, and then it's always exciting what we're eating, because whatever's sort of in the freezer I can pull out. It's like, we're eating shanks apparently tonight.
That's my favorite.
That's good, and then then you don't have to think about it either. And same sort of with local produce, right? It's like I eat what typically is just is available in seasonality. Although having moved to the north, I must say I had to get used to it, because till deep in July, I was still getting lettuce and beets from and radishes was the only thing I sold at the farmers market. So I was excited for the growing season, and I was like, okay, I can get everything from farmers markets again. But now up north we have a much shorter growing season, so I must admit I've been eating a little bit more out of seasonality as I normally do. But now, being July, it's great again. So
it's the perfect time for eating. And we cycle seasonality. We eat more meat in the winter, and we eat more vegetables and fruits in the summer when it's here, and just kind of subsist off of what's available to the best that we can. It's not perfect. I'm curious how all of this translates to the consumer. And I think that this is actually something that I've been really curious about and I've been talking with some other friends about is how do we how do we drive interest in some of in regenerative or agroecological beef, like the grass-fed beef that my husband and I raise or whatever it is. And I think that one of those value propositions is by showing the consumer that there is so much richness and diversity in compounds here. And so I'm curious how you see some of the applications of your work.
Yeah, I mean, we try to always make our papers as open access. We've linked up with the Bionutrient Institute, where we're starting a database where we put all of our findings. Just we'll publish in scientific literature, but it ends up 200 people reading it. No, maybe not that bad, but
I think a lot of people are reading your work.
yeah, we try to write it down in a way that's easy, and we pay open access, even though it means that I have to sell my kidney to pay for it. I happily do it because the open access fees are always like $5,000 or something like
I
that. Which
didn't
is
realize that.
yeah. Otherwise, it ends up behind a paywall. No one can read it, and
Yeah.
it's a real shame. It's a
Well, thank you.
don't get me on my soapbox of like the publishing
Ooh.
landscape in academia. But anyway, we're working with we've linked up with various group. One most notably the Bionutrient Institute for our beef nutrient density project, and the goal of that is just also put that data on open access where people can actually see the data, have a nice dashboard where they can compare across the supply chain, across ecoregion. Farmers can decide whether they want to put their name on it, or otherwise we just have the county and the state on their results. And if we have enough data points across North America, right, and sort of parse out some of these things that build soil health, and so because we're studying soil in that project, we're studying forage in that project, and we're studying meat in that project from these 250 farms. And we're still looking for more farmers, so if there's any interest, I would go
I was
to
gonna say.
bionutrientinstitute.org/beef, or just Google Beef Nutrient Density Project, Bionutrient Institute. You'll find it.
We'll have a link too.
Oh, perfect. And yeah, that's what we're working on, and that's really something that will take a few years to all the data to accumulate, but to put it all out there, that farmers can compare amongst each other, grass-fed and grain-fed systems, and what are also the metadata, like what are the forages that these animals were fed, how were they grazed, and things like that, so that is just accessible for people to see, and hopefully this will foster farmers learning from each other. I think that is so key, is that this peer-to-peer learning where farmers support each other, because even when I talk to many farmers, they kind of want to transition, but they don't know exactly how to transition because their father fed grains, their forefather fed grains, and maybe their father started off with cows. Their grandfather started off with cows. Their father had chickens, and now they have pigs or something like that. But sort of this grain feeding was the right. So it's like hard to break out of this sometimes. So you don't know where to start. So having this peer network of peer-to-peer is good. And I mean, it's sort of interesting to follow this whole scientific debate. On one hand, and almost like it's parallel universes. On one hand, you have this big push for alternative proteins in terms of sustainability, and on the other hand, in sort of existing an alternative universe, you have this agroecology, right, in livestock and plant agriculture too. I must admit, because there's certainly we were testing in the fall some berries and corn from more biodiverse systems, right?
Yeah.
We just started with meat because it was just interesting and hadn't been done a lot of work on it. And it was also sort of like a big concern of that. But we're starting other crops too, and tomatoes and you name it. We have working with a farm that has an integrated crop livestock systems, and we'll test about all their meats that come from that, their eggs and their produce, and then compare it to what we would buy in the store, and have a database of 50, 60 different crops, and do that. So we're trying to work.
Are you seeing differences are you seeing fairly big? Are they like no-till or use cover crops?
So we don't have that data analyzed, unfortunately.
Okay.
So I
It's coming.
couldn't tell you. Yeah, it's coming. That's right. That's on our goal for the fall. Um, but yeah, I mean, broader literature, there has been some work to suggest that yeah, using more agroecological systems. I mean, people have studied this mainly also in the context of berries, and you do see that a little bit of water stress for a berry can increase the anthocyanidins in the berries, and um, that I'm sure grown in more agroecological ways. Yeah, my hypothesis would be is that this is the case, but yeah, we'll see what the data says, and um, yeah, so we'll
Yeah.
stay tuned.
I think that's really exciting, and I do think that this has a lot of applications. And like I said, I have been talking to people that we need more of this to just educate consumers about what's possible. And I think that when you're sitting in the system and you feel part of it and you feel part of this rewilding aspect of things, that you can see it and you can feel it. And it's interesting to see a quantification of that experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us a little, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say is that on one hand, of course, it cannot be surprising that health is related amongst those systems, right? If you have, it's important that we have data, but this sort of these things that farmers see, like, hey, my animals look healthier, they seem happier, they are more content and things like that. Their social relationship improve. My forages look better, and then my soil starts to build more organic matter, right? So we're sort of evaluating that, and sometimes we find interesting things. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes we find things that were unexpected, and but yeah, generally you see this relationship among soil health and forage and animal health, and of course animal health and nutrient density are related because first and foremost, those metabolites in the animal, they're there for to support the health of the animal, not to support us. We can obtain nutrient value from it, and the same from a plant, of course, right? The plants are not there for us to consume, right? So first and foremost, the plant physiology, having more of these phytonutrients in the plant, is first and foremost to protect the plant itself, right? And we can manage that in a way that we can maximize nutrient value from that plant by the way that we grow it in biodiverse soils and nutrient-rich soils. And maybe give it some water, but not overwater it, or have some grazing, but not overgraze it, and things like that, right? But first and foremost, it's for the plant to either defend themselves from us. But where was I going with this? Oh yeah, is that sometimes we do find something interesting, and for instance, we are now have this part of the beef nutrient density project where we have various grass fat and grain fat, and we're seeing this spectrum where I'm looking at some of this data, I'm thinking like, this grass fat beef has a worse omega-6 to 3 ratio than grain fat beef. Or what are they feeding the animals, right? So, so you do see that there too, where there's such variation amongst that, and even like in the feedlot systems, we have some data that says omega-6 to 3 ratio of 8 to 1, or all the way up to 20 to 1. So even amongst the feedlot, it's different, and then amongst the grazing systems is also different. So yeah, certainly parsing out some of these ideas, but typically you see that the farmers that use really implement these agroecological methods, yeah, they have an omega-6 to 3 ratio of like 1 to 1.2, 1 to 1.5, or something like that. They're very close to 1.1, which is sort of the holy grail, but it's what not typically not reached, but you get very close to it.
Yeah. I want to thank you because I really think that your work does show that soil health, and I think a lot of this starts with soil health and is something that we desperately need to focus on building. And one of the things that I think is so beautiful is that the health of soil is the health of plants, is the health of animals, is the health of us, and cyclically it works in that way. And so I'm really appreciative of that. What are you working on right now? Is there anything, what have I missed? Is there anything that you really want to share that you're working on right now?
Yeah, so we have a big randomized control trial going on, a feeding trial, where we feed a quote-unquote regenerative diet or an agroecological diet. I like using the word agroecology more so than regenerative, but then no one will know what the hell I'm talking about. So, because it's hard to, when is something regenerative? No one knows.
Yeah.
At least agroecology, we have an idea of like, biodiversity, integrated crop livestock systems, and things like that. Rotational grazing could all follow under agroecology, sort of nature-based farming. But anyway, we're feeding a regenerative, agroecologically grown diet. We're working with various farms on that, mainly also the Green Acres farm. They have a integrated crop livestock system. So they grow 50, 60 different plants over the growing season. They also have animals that are integrated in that system. So we're sourcing a lot from them, which will be a regenerative diet. And then we buy similar products from the grocery store, basically your conventional non-organic produce, presumably coming a lot from monocultures. So we are feeding people that for 7 weeks, and then looking at health responses, doing metabolomics on their blood, on their urine, looking at their gut microbiome, getting after the idea, do more regeneratively grown foods, have an appreciable effect on human health, because our initial profiling studies suggest that, yeah, the food is more nutrient dense, but actually, does that improve our health? And that's something that we're looking at now. And certainly my hypothesis would be is that, a lot of people are consuming the standard American diet. So even the sort of our conventionally grown diet is still a pretty healthy diet because it's very low in ultra-processed foods. And then the agroecologically grown diet, obviously, also. And we were able to source that. And we were even able to source some of our grains, rice, and things like that, coffee from sort of biodynamic farms, right? It's even some of the bigger players like General Mills or and things like that. They have oats that come from sort of regenerative oats, they call it, that product, right? That come from fields that implant some sort of agroecology. Same with sort of our frozen fruit that we get from farms that have some sort of a nature-based farming, agroecology. So we build an entire diet out of regenerative agriculture, build an entire diet of conventional agriculture, and seeing what happens to people's inflammatory profiles, their cholesterol, their triglycerides, and also their metabolomics profiles, which could give us an idea of glucose health, glutathione metabolism, which is a major antioxidant, some of the fatty acids that circulate in their blood. So the actual individual types of fatty acids, omega-3s, but also these long-chain saturated fatty acids. So that's a very exciting project. It's 40 people. We're running, or about 36 to 40 people. There's always a few dropouts. That's just the nature of randomized controlled trials. But we're running about 18 to 20 this growing season, and another 18 to 20 next year. And so we accumulate an amount of people, and it's a project that I'm very excited about.
I'm excited about that project too. I think that's incredibly necessary, and I can't wait to see what happens to just see how all of that washes out, and hopefully maybe we can talk again when you have that data and look at that.
That would be my pleasure.
Yeah, I can't thank you enough. I know we're coming up on time, and I ask everybody this question on the show, and I'm curious to ask you, and it can be in a bigger sense or just at a personal level, but I like to ask people, what does it mean for you to lay the groundwork? And sometimes that's for generations to come, and sometimes it's just for your own family.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's kind of twofold. I mean, I should be 100% honest. I do a lot of this stuff because I want to know it, right? Because I'm very interested in it. So it's a little bit also for selfish reasons, but also, it can benefit, of course, a greater society, or at least that's what I hope. If nothing else, I had fun doing it. But yeah, a lot of these things where I got into this is like, I wanted to know about what grass-fed meat and milk, what it contains, right? And if this is healthier for my family or not, and things like that, just because of sheer interest. So that's sort of laying the groundwork means for me, because yes, as humans, we have some influence in our lifetime, but there's this saying is that the world's a mess. It's always been a mess, but the best thing we can do is straighten out our own lives. And if everyone does that, then the world may no longer be a mess. But I also don't have the, if you think about it sometimes, and it's like if you step back, our lifetime, where, such a minuscule impact on everything, right? Like in a blink of an eye. So we can make a difference, and we should, but we can make the most difference in sort of our local community and our environment. And I think that's first and foremost what we should go for, and that's, I think, laying the groundwork, what it means to me, at least.
Oh, thank you. That was a beautiful, perfect answer. Where can people find you? And we'll have links to all of this in the show notes.
So my Twitter handle is @Van Vliet PhD. So my last name, Van Vliet, followed by letters PhD. My Google Scholar profile. I find most of my publications. You just type my name in, and then Utah State University or Duke University, which is where I was before. You'll find me, and then I try to do podcasts and webinars on a regular basis, such as these. And it's great to have the opportunity to talk about our work. So you could probably YouTube my name, and then find some of the previous work. Also given some webinars where I actually go through all this data in a sort of a slideshow. Like I said, our papers are always open access. I try to write them up in a way that non-scientists can understand them, at least, because otherwise, what's the use, right? Science should to an extent be accessible for everyone.
Yes.
So those are the easiest way of finding me. Yeah.
Great. And we'll have links to all of those things. I want to thank you for the open access. That makes a really big difference. I know I spend a lot of time reading papers, and a lot of them exist behind a paywall. And so thank you. I didn't realize that it took money on your end, and thank you for also exposing that little piece of things. I really appreciate that and all of your work.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Kate. And it's great to connect with people that are doing the work on the ground. I always jokingly say is that, well, not jokingly, it's true, is that what I do is a lot of just, studying in the lab what farmers are doing on the ground and evaluating that, and hopefully I can provide some guidance and put some data behind it, and then maybe move the needle towards more agroecological systems. But this work would not be possible without farmers, and so I'm very grateful of that. And my best days at work are usually when I'm out at a farm collecting samples. It's a nice little break from the hecticness of academia sometimes, and connecting with farmers, and just talking to farmers. I learn a lot too. Always it always gives me new ideas. It's like, oh, so you're kind of observing that. Well, we should study that, right? And that's if that's indeed the case or not. I mean, we always keep an open idea. I must say, 9 out of 10 times what the farmer sees is something, or observes empirically, is something we then find in the lab too. But sometimes we find something interesting that may be very unexpected. And we live in an age of science and data, right? Everyone will always be showing the data, and at least we're trying to evaluate whether those practices are indeed more sustainable or not more sustainable, of course, right? Or if they improve nutrient density or diminish nutrient density. So that's what we're studying.
Well, I think it's great, and I think it adds a lot to this space, and I think it also adds a lot towards this goal of, for me, both nutrient density and biodiversity. And I think being in service to those things, you're doing amazing work. So thank you, and just thank you for taking the time.
You're welcome, Kate. Thank you so much for having me.